We go back to the year 1492. It is the year when Christopher Columbus, as the first European, set foot on American soil. But it is also the year in which the peace for the inhabitants is ended once and for all, because the Spaniards made in the year 1550 the American soil discovered by them to their dominion, which in turn led to the Native Americans gradually losing their habitat. But it wasn't just left with the conquest by Spain, especially since after some time other European powers with a good fleet and enough money for the expedition across the ocean became aware of the discoveries and moved along. Among them were Portugal, England, the Netherlands, and France, which then until 1660 claimed other parts of the American soil for themselves. The Europeans now expanded their conquered dominions, as this meant valuable raw materials and an expansion of their own country. But now one may ask, what happened to the local inhabitants? Well, only a few managed to escape because most of them became victims of colonialism. The Europeans wanted to bring American raw materials on their ships and sell them in Europe at a high price. Particularly popular commodities were sugarcane, tobacco, and gold, and Native Americans were responsible for mining them. However, they were by no means paid for it. No, they were enslaved and forced to mine them. But the plan of the Europeans did not work out. On their own ships, they brought in a weapon which killed more than half of the natives in a very short time. It was smallpox. Whoever got infected got a high fever and the skin was covered with pustules in a very short time, and apart from that, the risk of getting infected was extremely high. While the immune system of the Europeans was hardened, the virus became a killer for the Americans. Because even if you survived the infection, the body could no longer fight the fierce working conditions. Thus, about 90% of the indigenous people died out in a very short time. The Europeans, longing for the raw materials, needed new slaves. Then, about the year 1755, the Europeans came up with the idea of getting the slaves from another continent, and that was namely Africa. In Africa, there were at that time often disputes between the tribes of different cultures, and this in turn resulted in different tribes taking prisoners from each other. The tribal chiefs then sold those captives for valuable treasures from the Europeans. So the Europeans could then take hundreds of people in their ships from Africa to America, and the transatlantic triangular trade emerged. But the shipping of the future slaves was anything but humane. This image is a very famous one, and you're going to see it nearly every time someone talks about the harsh conditions enslaved people had to endure on the Middle Passage. We look at that image and we're horrified by what we see. Crammed into the lower decks of the ships, they remained in cramped quarters for weeks. They were mistreated and squatted in their own excrement. Those who became ill were simply thrown overboard. But what you almost never hear anyone talk about is that this diagram was actually a reform image. The British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act in 1788, which limited the number of enslaved people that could be stuffed into the hull of a ship. And this diagram was the result of that reform. This was the compromise. Stacking people like this was the better version of what was previously happening before the law was passed. So hopefully that helps you see how awful the conditions were that these Africans endured as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, it is believed that during the 400 years of American slavery history, About 40 million African people were enslaved in this way, and only 10 million, or 1 in 4 of them, survived the capture, abduction, and passage in the ship to America. Now, back to the triangular trade. Once these ships packed with enslaved Africans arrived in America, the slaves from Africa mined raw materials which were loaded into European ships. These sailed back to Europe, where numerous manufactories turned the raw materials into valuable trade goods. Sugarcane became rum, tobacco became cigars, and cotton became fine fabric. Now ships set sail again, which brought the commercial goods from Europe to Africa, and the cycle began again. And this Atlantic Triangle trade in turn creates a chain of further problems and conflicts, even internally in America, which seems all too familiar to some. In the history of mankind, man himself should not become part of trade. Should this not give us a pause for thought?